Good afternoon, I'm Matt Dancona and welcome to this very special Creative Sense Maker Live, supported by Santander, on children's literature and the questions of censorship and the controversies that have arisen around children's literature and writers recently, such as the late Dr. Seuss and David Walliams and others. As ever, we want to hear what you think and have to say, so please do chip into the chat, which is being ably helmed by my colleague Tom Goulding. We have a remarkable group of experts today. Karen Coates is a professor of education and director of the Centre for Research in Children's Literature at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Alice Curry is the founder and CEO of Lantana, an award-winning publishing house set up to promote diversity and inclusion in children's literature. And Michael Morpurgo is, I'm sure, known to all of you as author of numerous best-selling books and a former children's laureate. We welcome them all and you. So let's just dive in. Alice Curry, can I come to you first? Alice, you set up Lantana with the really important objective of improving diversity inclusion, I think. What problems or gap in the market did you feel you were addressing? And tell us a little bit about how you got to that point.
Well, I had an academic background before I went into publishing, and it became very clear through sort of, academic analysis of books that there was a real gap there. So the gap is very stark. It took a few years further, post setting up Lantana, to actually have any sort of actual surveys taken in the UK of the statistics around how stark the gaps were. But just by going into any bookshop, going into any library, it was clear that there were very many voices whose stories didn't get to be told. I think it sort of came home to me in a personal level when my sister married a man whose parents had emigrated from Hong Kong, and I knew there were going to be the prospect of mixed race children in the future, sort of in the near future, and I now have 3 little nephews and nieces. And it was that idea that they were going to grow up not being able to see themselves in the books they read, not being able to find recognizable sort of heroes, heroines, role models, to aspire to. So it became something of a personal mission as well as sort of an academic sense of responsibility, I guess, that idea that if these books aren't there, then they should be, and what can we do about it? So my personal response was to set up a publishing house. Challenging, is probably the least of the words I would describe it as, but it's something that seemed very necessary at the time. And as I said, it was a few years after that surveys started to be undertaken in the UK. There is an organisation called the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, and they undertook a nationwide survey in 2018 looking at the books that had been published in the UK in 2017, and they found that only 1% of those books featured a protagonist of colour, of minority ethnic background. So, and this is in juxtaposition to over a third of our school children, the sort of national total of school children who are children of colour. So, so the statistics were there to be seen now, and there's been a real sort of push within publishing to try and do something about this. But it is a very institutionalised and very insidious sort of structural issue within publishing. Our workforce is very homogenous in general, very white, middle class, able-bodied, heterosexual, and it is something that where change is happening, but gradually.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you, Alice. You were obviously a trailblazer in this, and Lantana's won awards and been regarded for its sort of pioneering work. But if you look across the sector as a whole of children's literature, do you think things are getting worse, better? Are they plateauing?
It's hard to tell. I mean, publishing itself, we're a sort of future forecasting type business. We're trying to, the books that we're commissioning at the moment won't come out for another couple of years. We're looking at sort of 2023 at this point. So a lot of the changes that are being happening are sort of behind the scenes at the moment. In terms of workplace change, I mean, there has been increase in certain sectors. So for instance, now women are over 50% of management roles in publishing. The percentage of people who identify with a disability has risen to, I think, around 11%. That's sort of about or no, sorry, I think around 8%. That's 4 times what it was a couple of years ago. LGBT plus representation, again, that has, I think, doubled in the last couple of years. When it comes to representation of people of colour, I think it's plateaued. It's around 13%. And so there is a substantial work to be done. I think there are initiatives that are trying to improve the situation. There's there's thankfully a move towards paid internships now, where there was a history of sort of unpaid work experience for people entering the publishing industry, which of course cuts out a lot of the people who can't afford to live unwaged, primarily in London. Again, the publishing industry is very sort of London and southeast centred. Southeast of England. So programs like paid internships, mentoring schemes, we ourselves offer a sort of shadowing opportunity for aspiring editors of colour to try and sort of train up sort of the next generation of the workforce. So there is change afoot, but again, it's institutionalised, it's slow.
So it's very interesting, because you're talking about a future-facing strategy, but one of the interesting characteristics, I guess, of children's literature is that even more than, for want of a better word, adult literature, grown-up literature, we tend to have a canon of past classics that get read and reread and told passed down from generation to generation, starting with myths and fairy tales and so on. How do you feel about the way in which we curate that canon, those past books, that sort of inheritance of children's books? I mean, there are obviously racist books whose titles I don't need to mention, that have been, as it were, pushed aside. But when you take something like The Cat in the Hat, where there's been a long debate about whether the Cat in the Hat draws on the minstrel caricature. How do you sort of achieve a balance in that?
It is in no way a cut and dry type scenario. I think there's no easy answers. I find it helpful to look at books using sort of the analogy of windows and mirrors, which is something that's talked about quite a lot in publishing. The idea that a book can be a window onto the world, so it can give you a new viewpoint onto a new country, a new historical period, a new planet, whatever it might be, and to sort of inspire imagination and so forth. But there's the idea of windows, of books being mirrors as well. So mirrors is, reflecting, the world back at you, reflecting yourself, your community, your society, which come with a sense of belonging. Can you see yourself in that book? Can you see yourself in that society? And I think when you're looking at classic children's books, if you look at them through those two lenses, then it gets interesting, because, if you look at them as windows, they're a window onto a historical period. They're a window onto a time when there were sort of ways of thinking that we don't find acceptable anymore. It's a way of bridging that gap and saying, okay, this is how we felt, this is now how we feel, and how our viewpoints and are changing over time, and we're improving the way that we act and so forth as a society. But I think when you look at it as mirrors, then that gets really problematic, because that's if these books are still in circulation, then what kind of mirror are we reflecting back at the sort of children of colour, say, who are reading these books? We're showing them a very, very distorted image, and is that okay? There needs to be a lot of guidance, there needs to be a lot of support in looking at these books in order to then sort of mitigate some of the damages and some of the danger that can come through by keeping them in circulation. So it is definitely not an easy, there's sort of no easy answer, I think, in that regard.
It's not dichotomous. We'll come back to that. Thank you very much, Alice. Michael Morpurgo, if I can come to you. You've written acclaimed books for children since the 1970s. And I've heard you speak before, and it's absolutely fascinating hearing you talk about the process. I mean, when you write, are you conscious of a message or the social assumptions you might be reinforcing or even planting, or is it actually a much more organic process when you write?
Well, for me, it is organic. I'm a very spontaneous writer. I respond in the first place to stories I hear, people I meet, places I go, which I guess is what every writer does. And here's the thing: I was a teacher for close on 10 years in primary school. And one thing I learned very, very quickly as a storyteller was not to think of the audience, was to look them in the eye and tell the story first. But in the doing of that, there of course comes a natural way of thinking, well, hang on, these are 10-year-old children in front of me. And if I'm talking to 5-year-old children, I'll adjust as well. We adjust all the time. And then when you're talking to much older children who have a historical perspective, perhaps, and then you will talk and you will write differently. But it's not out of any, I don't sort of think it through. This is what I ought to be doing. I'm just too close to my story to want to do that. Now, it so happens, I think, in my writing, I've grown up. I started writing in my 30s. I'm now in my 70s. And I was a child of just post-war, just post-empire. So much of the books that I was reading when I was young, which did form me to a large extent, they must do, were books that grew out of Edwardian and post-Victorian times. And so I read, for instance, there were in my library at school, there were, I think, more books by a man called G.A. Henty than almost any other author. There was Roald Dahl, wasn't known at the time. And why was he popular? He was telling tales about empire. He was also telling tales about history. But when I look at them now, I realize that it's horrifying, the assumptions behind almost every single book that he wrote. So I grew up like that. And I think what's happened is, as I'm taught the children, as I grew up myself, and I lived in this world where you actually look at the world differently, and not from believing that you're the center of the world, whether you're white or part of an empire, but simply as an individual who has empathized with the world for many, many, many decades, then your stories grow out of that. But it is unconscious, that's for sure. And sometimes I do it very deliberately. I wrote a story once called Medal for Leroy, because I was very conscious, having written Warhorse, where the people in it are white. They're certainly not middle class, but they're white. And I knew, because I'd read my history, that there were many, many black soldiers, Indian soldiers, soldiers from all over the world who fought and died in that war. And so I thought, well, actually, write a story centered around one of these. So I wrote a book called Medal for Leroy. And that was important to me, really important to me, to discover in the writing of a book a whole other history which I hadn't explored. So I think that's what writers have to do. We all have to grow up as we're doing it.
And, is there a problem when because you often write about times past, obviously, by definition, a lot of your books are set in historical contexts or retell myths. And is there a sort of a problem of reconciling the world and assumption that's completely different with the expectations, and to use Alice's metaphor, the mirror question? How do you marry those two, or can you?
Yes, I think you can. Yes, I've written a lot about history because I happen to think it's really, really important for us all, not just for children, but for me to explore in the first place. But I've also written a lot about, for instance, refugees and asylum seekers of today. And I think that's even more important, to be able to focus. I hope I've done it well, I don't know, other people will judge that. But to be able to focus on the experience of the people who get in small boats on the coast of France and try to come to this country, and the kind of comments that are made in the press about them again and again and again, to be able to focus on them not as refugees, not as asylum seekers, but as people, seems to me to be very important throughout our society, which, thank goodness, is made from people who come from away, whether they are white or black. They've come from the world now, and this is the world we live in now, and it's very, very important to be able to focus on what it is to be such a child, and then to reverse it. I think it's very important to think, hang on, we were refugees once. People seem to have forgotten that, after the Second World War, where there were ships loaded, 2,000 children that went off to Australia and places like this, with unwanted children who were either orphans or their parents didn't want them anymore or whatever. They were on these ships going to find new families in Australia, and the most appalling things happened to some of them. So it's important, we are all, to some extent, people who are refugees, who have been asylum seekers, either now or 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. And I think that's the critical thing, to kind of open a child's mind, and my mind too, with the experience of the world, not just of the country. And it is a big problem we got, I think, in this country in particular, because the English language is so dominant in the world of children's literature. Australia, New Zealand, America, the English language, wherever it's written, and this country, those are the books by and large our children read. Most of them from this country, set in this country, about this place and about this society. Well, other countries I go to, if I go to France, what do I discover? I discover that my publisher there, Gallimard, about between 40 and 50% of their titles for young people, Gallimard Jeunesse, are translated from other countries, other places. So what do French children do? They grow up learning much, much more about people from other backgrounds, other worlds. And we really need that. And it happens here, but it does not happen nearly so much. We rely massively on the English language to sell our books, I suppose, and because it's easier somehow.
Yes.
And I think that's important, really. We have to broaden the base, really, of what children read out so that they embrace the whole world, not just their own streets, their own country. I love
the image you conjure up of children's literature as a sort of two-way time travel corridor between past and present, and between different cultures and the one in which we inhabit. Michael, do you think, I mean, there is a very lively and quite a vivid debate at the moment about the political character of children's literature. Is there a risk that we worry about it too much, that we assign too much value or importance to the extent to which, for example, David Walliams depicts working class characters in a particular way? Do we worry too much about the extent that that will define children's ideas of a particular social category, for example?
Again, it is complex and it's difficult. I think the first thing I'd say really is this, that what really, really matters in this country is that children read, that we give them the opportunity to become readers from a very early age. Now, in amongst the books that they like, there are bound to be some which adults may not like, and they may think it's a poor influence on their children. I think that's true. I think it needs talking about it. It needs bringing out and open and talking about it. I don't think it needs finger pointing. What I do think is we've got to be aware of it, sensitive to it. But what it mustn't do, it really mustn't. And I suppose I was very struck by the title of our discussion, the word bad. Anything that says that about children's literature seems to me to be, I don't know, shooting itself in the foot. What we want are libraries in our schools, books in the hands of our children. Because until we become a fully literate society, I don't know what the percentage is. Alice will know much better than I do. I think the number of kids who leave school simply not being readers and will never read. They might read a headline here, but they're not going to be readers after that. It's almost a lost cause after that. They need captivating very young by teachers who love the stories, tell the stories, and we mustn't worry too much, about what there is in The Tiger Who Came to Tea, which, if you examine it, you may think, well, hang on, isn't this a bit sort of middle class? And you can go on like that forever, And what's really keen and important is that child, when he gets to the age of 5, is becoming a reader herself or himself. And then later on, they'll develop, they'll change, and they'll read more sophisticated books, and they will come to realize themselves. This is what books do. They allow you to realize yourself, the faults, if you like, in what has happened before. And that's really, really important. I mean, at the present moment, quite rightly, we are focusing massively on the history of slavery, which we have in this country. Well, it's healthy. It's really healthy. And it's sort of about time we stop brushing empire and that under the carpet and talking about it. And we talk about it in children's books. I once wrote a book called Twist of Gold about some Irish kids traveling across America looking for their father just after the potato famine. And they meet black people. These are the first time they've ever met black people. And so I wrote it in a way as if this was the first time they'd ever met black people and how strange it was. And I think the more we do that, the more we take children and put a book in front of them, which takes them on a journey, takes them to other places, takes them back in history, takes them into the lives of other people and other people's expectations and other religions, what they think about it all. I think it's critical. And if you use the word bad, I think what it does say, well, actually, books may not be that good for children. Of course, they're good for children. I mean, how else are these children going to learn empathy? How are they going to learn, if you're a boy, how it is to be a girl? You know, if you're a French child, how it is to have come from Sri Lanka. You read books about it, you know, not just about looking at a bit of film which lasts 30 seconds and that's it. No, you lose yourself in people's lives and travel the world that way. And it's so important at the moment.
I couldn't agree more. It's fascinating. Can I come to you, Karen Coates? You know, you have an amazing body of scholarship about this subject behind you. So can you for you know, the heart of thinking such as myself, I mean, can you give us some of the lessons, I suppose, of your academic researches for parents and publishers? What, you know, you've delved into the deep meaning of children's literature, and I just wonder how that scholarship translates into the judgments and decisions we should be making now.
Thank you. The question that you had asked about, you know, should we take it so seriously, is absolutely, of course. And in fact, we should, as a culture, we should be taking the literature, then the culture that we consume as children, or that our children consume, that we offer to our children, much more seriously than we do. Precisely because of some of the things that Michael was talking about. They do influence us. They do, they set the terms for what we consider aesthetically pleasing, aesthetically beautiful. They teach us what our culture values or devalues by exclusion, as Alice was saying. So it's incredibly important. On the other hand, it's of limited importance in light of what they're getting at the kitchen table. Okay, so it's important to have the conversations around the book. So it's not just that, I mean, one of the crusades that I'm on, it's not just that children should be reading children's books. Adults should never stop reading children's books. And you should not stop reading them even if you don't have children, because you want, these are indexes, these are cultural indexes as to what we care about, what we value. Our emotional capacities kind of remain the same over historical periods and times, but the stories that set what's valuable, what's desirable, what we think that we want children to be like, because it is a future-oriented genre, they're embedded in these books that children read. So I'm thinking about one of the things that I get resistance in my scholarship is that I always consider the audience, and I consider it differentially, because as Michael says, when you're writing for a 10-year-old, you're going to write differently than you're writing for a 5-year-old. So we need to understand what kids are doing. And they are taking in information about the sound, the music of their language from before they're born. Mm. I mean, we can hear, you know, they've done the studies about children whose parents read to them in the womb. And within minutes after birth, they recognize certain kinds of poetic forms. So it's incredibly important. But then once we're born, once we've come out of the womb, for sighted children in particular, sight kind of becomes the king of the senses. So the images matter. And again, what you're doing is you're taking in information all the time. And what we know about children's development is that they're developing, as their brains develop, they're putting things in categories. They're learning gender categories. They're learning, you know, what mommies do, and they're learning it in a very concrete way. They're learning what mommies do. They're learning what daddies do. They are metaphoric thinkers up until about age 5, and then they become very literal thinkers for a short period of time, and then their metaphors open up again. So it's fascinating. I'll give you an example. When my daughter was 3, she had not read this book called Stella Luna, and she grabbed it off the shelf and she was looking through the pictures, and I said, "Well, tell me the story here. What's happening here?" And she said, "Oh, well, this is a story about a baby who leaves her mother and has to go to school and has a mean teacher, and then eventually comes home and she's with her mother again, and she's and everything's okay." And I'm looking at her, I'm like, this is a story about a bird, a bat, who falls from her mother's breast into a bird's nest, and there are other birds there, and the mother bird scolds her for teaching her bat friends to hang by their feet. I mean, teaching her bird friends to hang by their feet rather than, and then yes, she does find her mother again, and everything's okay. And I'm like, okay, so what did I like? Okay, so the question of what kids see in books is something we need to investigate. What do they see? I mean, you know,
I mean, it's very interesting. You talk about they may see a different code to the code we see, as it were, when we're reading to them. And certainly when my kids were growing up, I mean, and indeed to nephews and nieces and godchildren, goodness knows what, you know, it's and I remember from my own childhood that kids love mischief and misrule and villainy in stories. It's part of the delight. So how do we avoid blandness, to be frank? You know, how do we keep that sort of the zest and the vim in children's stories?
Well, that I think that has become actually more tricky in the current climate than it was than it has been in the past, because one of the things that we're not trusting anymore is humor, and whether kids get humor, and whether they get irony, and whether they see, you know, I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking we need to do more research into how kids process caricature, because if you go with, there's been a kind of tip toward realism, especially even in picture books. And when C.S. Lewis said once, he said, you know, I never really expected the world to be like the fantasies that I read, but I kind of did expect them to be like the world that was realistic. You know, in my realistic text, I expected the school story to be like, school to be like the school stories I was reading. And so if we translate that to images and think about caricatures, how are children reading them? I mean, the question that you ask in the blurb for this is, for a 6-year-old, isn't the Cat in the Hat really a cat? Well, or just a cat? It doesn't look like a cat. It doesn't look like anything like a cat. So they're learning conventions, but they're also learning conventions of humor and style. And so it's tricky and problematic, and you have to have the conversation with them. What do they see when they look at a book? You have to talk to them, and that will become, you know, kids are very sensitive to scripts. They learn the form of a joke, for instance, before they learn how a joke works. Any of you have talked to a 5-year-old trying to do knock knock jokes? They're not funny, you know, because they know the form, and they go and they think they're hilarious, but they don't know why they're funny. So it's a matter of listening to them and then interpreting what they say against what you know about that particular child and what you know about children in general. So I think it's really important to focus on what we know about their moral development, what they know about their aesthetic development, how they're looking at things. I mean, all of that is part of this, has to be part of this discussion. And all too often it gets evacuated out of this discussion saying that this book is bad. This book is bad because of these things. But it has, our conversations have to be more nuanced than that, I think.
So when you're talking about, I mean, a book like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, which has really survived. You know, I loved it. My kids loved it. It seems to have endured. It's a festival of cruelty, in the sense that you know, terrible things happen to all the kids apart from Charlie, and you know, he is selected because he is the one who doesn't transgress in Willy Wonka's eyes. Is that still an acceptable book in today's society?
It depends on who you talk to, obviously, but here's the thing. The point of that book in many ways, or the appeal of that book, is that kids do have an innate sense of justice. I mean, Paul Bloom, who's done the work at the Yale Baby Lab, that sense of justice is testable for infants under the age of 1 year old. They have this innate sense of wanting wanting helpful characters to be rewarded, and wanting unhelpful characters to be punished. But that also plays to their bias. They want characters like them, that they identify like them, to be helped, and they want characters who are not like them, who they disidentify with, to be punished. Okay, so that innate sense of story, it's a very simple story, but it's an innate sense of plot that goes justice, reward, injustice, punishment. And that is what Roald Dahl is playing with in that book. Yeah. And so the characters who behave in abominable ways, and he actually puts a lot of that emphasis on the parents and how those kids have been raised.
Yeah.
And so, so it's not just the kids who are being punished, it's the parents who are being scolded for bad parenting.
Yeah.
And so, that's also part of the appeal of this book. It's like, these are bad kids. They deserve to be punished. Good kids deserve to be rewarded. However, what might be problematic about that book is that Charlie does nothing but behave himself, and he gets all the chocolate. And that is, kind of really difficult, I would say, for poorer children, because they don't get all the chocolate, even no matter how well they behave. Yeah. It's kind of like the Santa Claus myth. You get punished, you get presents if you're good. Well, if your parents don't have money to give you presents, does that mean you're bad?
Yeah.
So it's a problem in an ideological sense, but the appeal of it has to do with this idea that I want bad people punished.
Thanks.
Because I'm not.
We will come back to you. Can I come to Kirsty Lowy, I think it is? Sorry if I misspelled your... actually, no, let's come to... Sorry, I beg your pardon. Mark Benjamin first, and then Kirsty. Mark, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Mark. You had welcome. You had a very interesting story in the chat about how you helped curate a broader library of books for your town. I wondered if you might talk about that.
Oh, right. Well, to start with, I was librarian in the town for much of my career, having moved up from London. Was very aware that I'd moved into white Christian England, which professionally I sort of tried to ensure that our stock was wider than it had been traditionally. But it was really only when I started producing my own children that I realized that they could very easily grow up in a very monocultural setup. So I did make active efforts to find a wider range of material. But what I mentioned in the chat was something more recent. I can't unfortunately now remember the name of the charity, but it's a small charity that is dedicated to spreading a wider range of children's material into schools, and it crowdfunded for packs that you could nominate a school to receive, and that's what I did for our local first school, which is still, even in sort of the 2020s, 99% white.
Would that there were more people like you, Mark. Thank you very much. I'd like to come to Kirsty Lowy now. So sorry, Kirsty, for the confusion there. You made a very good welcome. You made a very good point in the chat about how, as it were, to reconcile kids' love of villainy and wickedness and misrule with modernity. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, just it's very, because this is children that we're speaking about, and Mark said in the chat that it's the responsibility of parents and teachers, not creative writers. I'm studying for a master's in creative writing, and if you want to write something horrible for adults, you knock yourselves out. But for children, there's a responsibility similar to how I expect Matt D'Ancona at Tortoise to behave responsibly in his journalism. There's a level to which I think that we should have responsibility when writing for children. And so there's a fairly simple barometer of if this is something that could be used as a weapon, as a tool for bullying, then can we show this another way? So if you're showing a villain, villainy, tricks, justice, all of these things can be shown, but without maybe pulling in, sometimes like it would be subconscious what you would do, but without pulling in. So for instance, the twits, they're ugly people. And so is that something that could be used as when children are trying to understand justice, are they going to see these horrible people who have been made physically ugly? It's a great metaphor, but is it something that's necessarily helpful for children's understanding? Should that be top of their reading list? I don't know, I don't have any children, so I will write exclusively for adults, given the opportunity, and stay out of any potential influential children's minds, I think.
No, but I'm sure you're right that there needn't be a kind of it needn't be a trade-off. I'm sure there's a way of doing it. Can I come to my colleague Tessa Murray now? Tessa, you made a really good point about just the basic access kids have to books, and I wondered if you could talk about that, because it's such a point.
I'm having a very comfy time on the sofa for this one.
Settling down for story time.
But I am. It's like Listen with Matt and Mike. Lovely. No, I was thinking that we're talking about the luxury of what children read. You know, we're in a slightly luxurious position about talking about the influence of what children read once they are reading. And for me, you know, sort of as a, you know, both as a parent but also as an absolutely voracious reader as a child, what I find incredibly worrying is just the sheer lack of access to books. You know, books are not a you know, as far as I'm concerned, buying books is not a discretionary spend, but in most households actually books are a luxury. And you know, we've got a really fundamental issue of just kids reading anything, let alone the right stuff. And you know, I mentioned that for all the 17,000 reasons we love Dolly Parton, another one is the Books for Kids program that's been so successful in the States, and I'd love to see something similar over here.
No, it'd be great, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a serious worry, and you know, the number of where I live in Southeast London, the library capacity is just as utterly depleted. It's very sad. Could we go to Louise Simpson? I was very struck by a point you made about a scene in Elf, and from which I took you to be perhaps lightheartedly, but concerned about us all being too politically correct. Is that? I mean, do you think that's where we're heading?
Well, yeah, just by some of the conversation that's been going on, I think, you know, I think people, I mean, I actually don't like Roald Dahl books, but when he was writing, was he considered amazing? Were the books considered acceptable when they were written? I doubt it. You know, he wrote from himself. I don't know. I just don't think you should thwart creativity in that way and kind of put preconditions, you know, for happy tomatoes and sad peaches, just so that you keep everybody happy. I think children are incredibly resilient, and I think it's great that there's obviously more diversity, and the man talking about, you know, the bookshop up in wherever he is all brilliant. But I think that will come about naturally because the writers will be coming from those different diversities anyway. They just need the opportunity to get these books published, which again I think seems to be also being addressed. But yeah, I wouldn't thwart any kind of creativity because, yeah, I just wouldn't.
I mean, do you think actually we are, because we've more or less taken it as a premise that there is a read across from what children encounter in the stories they read and the fantasies that the escapist fantasies they read. Is that right, do you think?
Well, I think the separation of, I think the window and mirror.
Well, you've gone on mute, Louise. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
You're back. Yes, you're back. Welcome back.
Okay. I don't know. I promise you, I didn't touch anything.
techno attack. So,
Sorry, I don't even know what I was saying when I was silent.
you're just about to start your answer. So if you can press rewind. About it was just about the whether there is in fact a read across.
Well, I think the mirror and window thing is great, but I think the books that I liked as a child were nothing to do with anything to do with me at all. I like Beatrix Potter and mouse stories and Black Beauty. If the story is good, then the value is in it.
So it's about quality rather than ideology. Can I come to my colleague Ellen Halliday, who made a very interesting point about access, which, hi Ellen, how are you?
Hello, I'm fine, thanks.
Like, can you retell that story and sort of maybe, compare it to your own experience about access and the specifics of lockdown, because I think it's a brilliant point.
Yeah, well, it's just anecdotal. So if anybody has kind of more concrete evidence, we'd love to hear about it. But a good friend of mine who's a primary teacher in London, she teaches sort of, the sort of first year of schooling. So she has seen a massive growth in the inequality in the kids that she teaches coming back from the pandemic, because some of them had started to learn to read at school, gone home, and their parents had been able to continue teaching them, and they'd been reading through the pandemic. But others had absolutely no access whatsoever. So they've just gone backwards, and that there's now this like widening gap between them that is really hard to catch up on, which I think, it seems like a key developmental stage. And I'm just interested to see what effect that will have going forwards. And I mean, it's an argument, I think, for keeping libraries open for, as Tessa said, making sure everybody has this access to read, because clearly at home, it's not equally distributed. That was kind of it, really. No, it's a real, I think a lot has been said about the inequalities of digital literacy during the pandemic, and rightly so, but also the inequalities of traditional literacy, I think, have been entrenched, and it's a real worry. Megan Mallier, I wonder if we could come to. Megan, hi, are you there? Hi, Megan.
Hi, yes.
You just made a really, what I kind of think is sort of a core point, which I wondered if you could talk about, which is the actual purpose of reading and why children should read.
I was just looking back at my own experience. Like, me and my sister were both brought up loving books, like from even before we could speak, really. Our parents would read to us. But I'm looking back at my time in middle school, for example, where we used to have a kind of sticker chart on the wall, and teachers would actually reward students for reading a book. So I remember my friends, a lot of them didn't like reading, so it became a thing, like just another piece of homework. So I think kind of treating, and it's the way it's portrayed. Exactly. Reading is kind of portrayed as a chore, so it takes the joy out of it. And I think that has serious repercussions on later life, because children aren't brought up loving books, really.
No, I think that's a really important point. I wondered if I could come back to Alice Currier. Alice, we've heard so many interesting points, and you may want to respond to one or two of them. And another I wanted to kind of throw in is, how do we kind of decode the fact that something like Harry Potter, which is set in what is essentially an old-fashioned boarding school from another era, kind of kindled this global fascination, and seemed also to introduce children to a liberal ethic. That phenomenon, leaving aside all the controversies about J.K. Rowling, that phenomenon seemed to me a fascinating case study.
Well, I mean, I think if I knew the secret of Harry Potter's success, I'd be a much better publisher than I am. I think ultimately, lots of really interesting points have been made. I think ultimately we just have to think of who's doing the reading and therefore who's doing the learning. So if we're putting across a problematic text, I mean, I like the point about the sort of the ugly twits and, you know, that the villain always has a scar. For children with scars, that's quite confronting. But so I think we're presupposing a white reader in most cases, and I get the argument that it's you know, that creativity should not be you know, squashed in any way. I understand that, but we also need to think you know, if we're making assumptions as a publisher or as an author or as a teacher who's giving books, or a parent, you know, we need to just think at whose expense is that happening. So I think for us, you know, take the example of the racist books. If we're saying, okay, but we're going to learn, or we're going to discuss, or we're going to sort of use them as a point that we've moved on from collectively or whatever. I mean, that's basically saying that sort of, you know, people of color, or the people who are experiencing racism on a daily basis, we're sort of using them as a tool for the self-improvement of white people, right? For our self-improvement. And I think that's not really an acceptable position to put them in. So I just, again, yeah, really, really, really complex, just always sort of having to sort of think, what assumptions are we make in pitching a book at a particular audience, or with a particular you know, set of characters or values that we're esteeming, and is that at anyone's expense?
No, absolutely. Can I come? Thank you so much. Can I come to Michael now? Michael, how resilient do you think children are, or to reframe the question, do we make a mistake sometimes in thinking that they are entirely blank sheets of paper, and that we just, in the stories we tell them and in the things we say to them, we just write upon them? Because I suspect that we underestimate their interactivity and the kind of fizzing imagination that they have, that's stimulated by terrific children's writing.
I think that's right. I mean, most of children's imaginative world, I think, goes on between them. I mean, I've got many grandchildren now, and when they come to stay, what you see is 3 or 4 days when they get together with friends, they simply live in that bubble of themselves. And yes, there may be a story in the evening, but they are creating their own worlds of magic, and they are also, I'm sure, creating their own worlds of prejudice as well. I think the great difficulty really for me in this whole subject is that we must be very careful, certainly not to inhibit writers' writing. We're all going to make mistakes, that's for sure, and we mustn't be thinking all the time of what mistakes we might be making. We must look the children in the eye as we're telling these stories. And what am I doing? I'm saying, I'm me. I'm this ancient 77-year-old. I've lived when I've lived. And it's interesting what you talked about, you know, a bygone era of the Harry Potter sort of background. Matt, I would just say to you that you are treading upon my era. And I've been there that long. We didn't learn what they learned at Hogwarts, but that sort of atmosphere was there. And I think the important thing is that they just love the books. They may learn on the way difficult things. There's certainly not enough in terms of good literature out there. I mean, we have wonderful Mallory Blackman and Jamila Gavin and people like this who are writing from a particular experience, and that's what's important. They are writing from their experience. They know the world they've come from, the culture they've come from, as I know mine. And what's important really is that we simply put it out there, and the children will do with it what they want to do with it. They won't finish it if they're bored. They'll just turn the last page and be done with it. But what I did find as a teacher, and I just wanted to say this really, is that the most powerful thing for me we can do in a school with 30 kids, 35 kids in a class, is tell them a story altogether that resonates with all of them. And I used to regularly, 3 to past, because I had a brilliant head teacher who made us do this. We would just sit the children down, 3 to past, last half hour of the school day, everyone was too tired to do anything else, and they listened to a story. And I read stories that I felt very strongly resonated with me, and I'd read them with a passion. And the rule was, and this head teacher was somewhat farsighted, she said, whatever you do, when you've finished reading to them, do not ask them questions. It mustn't become a lesson. You know, this is not a comprehension test. read the story, and leave them to go out of that classroom, across the playground, and wander their way home with the story still in their head. And that, I'm sure, captivates children, because the adult reading to them, and indirectly the author that has written it, is talking to them. It's a private thing, it's a personal thing. And they will make up their minds, they'll wonder about it, doubts will come, and that's important. Doubt is really important. When we're not solving problems for them, no, what we're doing is suggesting when they're young and letting them work it out We're not proselytizing when we write.
I'm sure the answer is different, Michael, for different age cohorts, but one thing that's come up during the discussion, which I find fascinating, is the extent to which children can understand wit and irony and how literalist or not they are. And I wondered what your terrific wealth of experience suggests to you about that.
I just think it's so difficult, because they come in all shapes and sizes, these children. Yeah. Some are, again, I have to think very personally, I have to think of my grandchildren, and some are absolutely fixated by wit. Whatever makes him giggle is going to be great. And if it's a book, terrific, he'll want to read the next one. And whatever makes him fearful will do the same. I think irony is not something he gets yet, but he maybe will come to that. I just think it's important to, as a writer, for me to simply put out there. I don't write funny much. I write sad, which I happen to think is just as important as funny and witty, because that is something that all children have to confront. They have to confront loneliness, and they have to confront grief anywhere in their lives, and many of them have done that before they ever come to my books. And I think it's important that we write about emotions, we write about what they are already feeling. It makes them feel less alone in the world. And I think there's something about the books being a great comfort, and that they'll find their right writer for their irony or their humor or their sadness, whatever. They will find the right writer. And it's that search through the books. And there was a wonderful speaker earlier on saying something which I believe so much. And that is, if you don't have the books, they're never going to find the pathway anyway. Yeah. So if you don't have the libraries, it is criminal in this country of Shakespeare and Philip Pullman that we have libraries. I think there's only 1 in 8 schools have hardly a library to be spoken of. It's appalling, and always in exactly the places where they need the literature most, where they're lacking it most. It's just extraordinary that we go on doing this and doing this and doing this. I was in my own primary school in London not long ago, and I almost couldn't tell the difference between the library in 1947 when I was there and now. Books that had been replaced for ages and ages and ages, and everything was worn out, there was no money. And you're thinking, well, hang on, we're abandoning these people, and we're abandoning them really to a life without stories. And that's dreadful, because they are going to have to come across all these things we've talked about, whether it's developing prejudice or whatever. They're all going to have to sort this stuff out as they're growing up, and books can help them do that.
Yes, I mean, it's such an important point, Michael, that access to books and literature to people of all ages shouldn't be down to an accident of birth. Karen, I wondered if I can come to you as we approach the end. I just wanted to, you have the scholarly eye here, and also a transatlantic kind of view as well. I know you're in the States at the moment. When you look at the world of children's literature as it's developing, are you an optimist? Do you think things are heading in a progressive and exciting direction, or is it getting worse?
Yes and no. I mean, I have to say, again, I never give definitive answers on these things, but I do feel like we are entering a renewed period of overt didacticism in children's books. It's what I flippantly call hipster piety. Back in the complaint has always been that children's books indoctrinate children into a particular religious perspective. And I think now we've got a lot of books that are trying to really focus kids on certain ideological perspectives, which have become, it makes the books boring. And I'm with Michael. You tell a good story and the kid will work out what they can take from it that's useful, and they'll discard those things that they don't find useful. But I'm also thinking in terms of all of the things you've said, the literacy research shows it doesn't matter what method you use to teach kids. The empirical research shows that the only thing that improves literacy rates anywhere is access. The more access you have to books, you will learn to read. It's just a fact. So it doesn't matter. But then we also need to not inhibit. We talk a lot in our courses about not having a single story. You don't want to have like this is I've read a book about what it means to be Black, and so I understand that now. Or I've read one story about what it means to have a gay experience, and that I know what that means now. And that's the risk that we're going through right now, is that social media protests are trying to control narratives of identity in very narrow ways, and disallowing people, even within certain kinds of identities, to tell a story that might run counter. And they have to be able to tell counter stories. And children need more stories rather than fewer, in terms of learning about what it feels like to be Michael Marpugo, what it feels like to be Mallory Blackman, what it feels like to write out of these experiences. We're not spiders. We don't have these innate ideas of how to be who we are, but we're also not blank slates. And so we're always taking in information. We're always testing that information. We're always seeing how that feels in our bodies and feels in our thinking. And then as we grow, we test it against the belief systems that we want to hold on to, whether they be spiritual or secular or whatever. We're always going to test those things. And that's what kids need they need support for that, obviously, but they'll get it from their peers, but they also need it from adults who love them.
Absolutely.
And that's so.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful parting thought. We have reached the top of the hour, so alas, I have to draw things to a close. But before I do, just to try and splice together some of the many extraordinarily interesting threads that we've seen in this discussion. Alice, I think, very correctly described literature as a mirror, and reminded us that it's very important that we not forget and that we be mindful of issues of representation in literature, as indeed in all forms of literature. And Mark, I think, gave us a sort of case study in how you can do things at a local level to curate, local libraries that really open up people's eyes to the diversity of modern society, and that's an extremely important mission. And Karen used some fantastic phrases. I think cultural indexes is one I'll keep and collect and steal if I may, and also that as important as it was to bear in mind issues of representation, we mustn't yield to what she called equally wonderfully hipster piety. But also I like the fact that Karen emphasized that these weren't simple questions, and I think that's absolutely true. I was very encouraged by Kirsty's very positive message that actually we mustn't set up a false dichotomy. It's possible to be respectful of people, but also to keep the tropes of villainy and fun and misrule in children's literature, and it's a counsel of despair to suggest otherwise. And I think Michael made a series of really exciting, interesting points, and not least the absence of translations in this country is one I hadn't thought of before, but it's so important. And the need to always be mindful of the story first, but also the audience as well, and to proliferate children's literature and to have a predisposition towards more rather than less, even as you remain conscious of the changing context. And I think, it wasn't actually in the terms of trade at the beginning of the thinking, but the biggest sort of message I take away from this is the love of children's literature we all share, and the feeling that was very powerful from everyone that there is insufficient access at the moment in this doubtless in other countries, and that this is perhaps something tortoise should look at more, because the scandalous depletion of the library sector is something that I think is a real problem. And I thought Ellen's anecdote about lockdown was a genuinely kind of provoking and unsettling and worrying one. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to what's been certainly for me an absolutely fascinating hour, and particular thanks to our splendid experts Alice, Karen and Michael. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, have a lovely weekend, and we'll see you very soon again. Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.